Hello and welcome back to the Pluviophile Papers. Today we're going to be thinking about the Brontes, who are on everybody's minds at the moment because of the new Wuthering Heights film. We all know Wuthering Heights and we're all thinking about Wuthering Heights because of this film. But in today's video we're going to be thinking about the publication history of Wuthering Heights. There is a really interesting history of publication behind this book, which involves all four of the Bronte siblings, and which I hope you find as interesting as I do, and hopefully you walk away from this having learned something. This video isn't going to focus on the actual process of writing Wuthering Heights, but if you're interested in that, there is an excellent book by Edward Chittum called The Birth of Wuthering Heights, which kind of runs through the genetic process of writing the book. So this whole story starts in 1846 when Anne, Emily and Charlotte Bronte co-wrote and published a book of poetry, and they did this under the pseudonyms Cara, Ellis and Acton Bell. Now, the poetry collection was not a great success and only 2 copies were sold. It was also said that the only poems of any merit were those by Ellis Bell or Emily Bronte. In her article, Emily Bronte in the Hands of Male Critics, Carol Oman writes, and I'm just going to read this aloud to you because it's interesting. The pseudonyms all of the Brontes chose for their joint volume of poems and for their novels were, Charlotte reported, deliberately selected to admit of ambiguous interpretation. They did not wish to choose names avowedly masculine. They would not call themselves, for example, Charles, Edward and Alfred. On the other hand, as Charlotte wrote afterwards, we did not like to declare ourselves women, because without at that time suspecting that our mode of writing and thinking was not what it is called feminine, we had a vague impression that authoresses are liable to be looked on with prejudice. We had noticed how critics sometimes use for their chastisement the weapon of personality, and for their reward a flattery which is not true praise. Kind of talking to this, women are going to be patronised. It's going to be seen as like this amazing thing that a woman was able to write something good. And so when they write under these pseudonyms, it's not because they otherwise won't be published. There are, of course, a number of female novelists at this time. Jane Austen, who was writing in the 18th century, continues to be in print. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, though initially published anonymously, was published again under her own name in 1823. And then you've got the Irish Maria Edgeworth, whose books were being printed and translated into English in the 1830s. So female novelists do exist and they are being published. But Charlotte Bronte rightly notes that there is an advantage in publishing under a male name, or rather a name which is neither distinctly masculine nor feminine. So then in October 1847, Charlotte Bronte is the first of the sisters to send a novel to be printed and published. Written under the name of Cara Bell, this was published in October 1847, and then Emily Bronte, under the name of Ellis Bell, published Wuthering Heights in December of 1847. And these books were sent from the post office in their local village of Haworth, which is actually now a coffee shop, so you can go and sit inside this historic place where these novels were sent off. So the very first British edition of Wuthering Heights, published in December 1847, is basically impossible to find now. There are very few copies, and when they come on the market they go for astronomical amounts of money, but the British first edition was published under the name Ellis Bell. The following year, Wuthering Heights appeared in America, and unlike the British first edition, this was actually published completely anonymously. It held no author's name at all. Instead, it was published with, quote, by the author of Jane Eyre, kind of merging together the Bell siblings, because there was some talk among critics that Acton, Cara and Ellis Bell were all the same person, and it was written with this line because Jane Eyre was popular, and so it was a way to kind of ride on the back of that book. So what was the critical response to Wuthering Heights? It was very mixed, and it wasn't initially very popular at all. And this came from the fact that the book was very different to anything which had been published before. If you've read Wuthering Heights, you know how emotional it is, you know how kind of dark it is, and how morally complex the characters are. Like Heathcliff and Cathy are unlike any characters really that you see before. So this is one review from Douglas Jerrold's weekly newspaper, which says, Wuthering Heights is a strange sort of book, baffling all regular criticism, yet it is impossible to begin and not finish it, and quite as impossible to lay it aside afterwards and say nothing about. In Wuthering Heights the reader is shocked, disgusted, almost sickened by details of cruelty, inhumanity, and the most diabolical hate and vengeance. The women in this book are of a strange, fiendish, angelic nature, tantalising and terrible, and the men are indescribable out of the book itself. I will leave below some details of different pieces of criticism which were written because the reviews are so interesting to read. But tragically, only a year after Wuthering Heights was published, Emily Bronte died in December 1848 in Haworth. And then even more tragically, a year after that, Anne Bronte died as well. So within the space of 2 years, Charlotte went from being one of 3 sisters to the only sister. And in 1850, another edition of Wuthering Heights was published, and it was published with an introduction by Charlotte Bronte. And I'm going to read you an extract from this because it's such a beautiful kind of dedication to her sisters. So she writes, "It has been thought that all the works published under the names of Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell were in reality the production of one person. This mistake I endeavoured to rectify by a few words of disclaimer prefixed to the 3rd edition of Jane Eyre." For reference, this is the preface she's referring to. And as you can see, she says, "My claim to the title of novelist rests on this one work alone." So essentially she is saying, Wuthering Heights was not written by me. Indeed, I feel myself that it is time the obscurity attending those 2 names, Ellis and Acton, was done away. The little mystery which formerly yielded some harmless pleasure has lost its interest. Circumstances are changed. It became then my duty to explain briefly the origin and authorship of the books written by Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell. About 5 years ago, my 2 sisters and myself, after a somewhat prolonged period of separation, found ourselves reunited and at home, resident in a remote district where our education had made little progress and where consequently there was no inducement to seek social intercourse beyond our own domestic circle. We were wholly dependent on ourselves and on each other, on books and study, for the enjoyments and occupations of life. She goes on to explain how in 1845 she had come across a manuscript volume of Emily's kind of handwritten poems and how that had been the inspiration for writing and publishing that initial poetry book. We had very early cherished the dream of one day becoming authors. We agreed to arrange a small selection of our poems and, if possible, to get them printed. Averse to personal publicity, we veiled our own names under those of Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell, the ambiguous choice being dictated by a sort of conscientious scruple. And she goes on to explain why they chose names that were neither feminine nor masculine, as we explored earlier in the video. She then writes in this letter how and when both of her sisters died. And she writes, "This notice has been written because I felt it a sacred duty to wipe the dust off their gravestones and leave their dear names free from soil." Interestingly though, and as you maybe noticed, she never uses the surname Bronte, and she herself signs off this preface with the name Currer Bell, still retaining that kind of ambiguous identity as somebody who could be a man. She gives the first names Emily and Anne, but she does not say that they are the Bronte siblings. So 1850 is the first time that Wuthering Heights is accredited to Emily Bronte. However, that is not the end of this journey of kind of muddled authorship, because even after this was revealed, when it became known that the 3 sisters also had a brother, Bramwell, critics suggested, and increasingly suggested, that it was Bramwell who had written these novels instead. So in 1867, 20 years after it was published, the claim was first published. The Halifax Guardian reprinted an anonymous article from People's Magazine, which basically said, there is no way that Wuthering Heights could have been, quote, conceived by a timid and retiring female. And then Mr. William Dearden went on to kind of explore the possibility of Bramwell having written it instead. And so even after Emily Bronte was revealed as the author, the Bronte sisters' kind of suspicions ended up coming true, because when it was revealed that it was written by a woman, there were some critics who refused to believe that. So yes, that is some insight into the pseudonym of Ellis Bell as the author of Wuthering Heights. I hope you found this interesting, and I will see you next week with another pluviophile paper.